Hello, I'm Ross Hetrick, president of the Thaddeus Stevens Society, and I'm introducing a video which features a talk by Fergus Bordewich about his new book, Congress at War: How Republican Reformers Fought the Civil War, Defied Lincoln, Ended Slavery, and Remade America. And this is the book. Mr. Bordewich is also the author of other books about the Civil War era and the Revolutionary War era. The talk came during the fall 2020 Zoom meeting of the Thaddeus Stevens Society, which was held on December 4th, 2020, which is the 155th anniversary of the day that Thaddeus Stevens and Edward McPherson excluded ex-Confederates from Congress, thus setting the stage for Reconstruction. We were hoping to include in the presentation a video about that, but that was not possible. And if you're seeing this, you might also have a link in the email to that video, which I would urge you to look at, since it basically summarizes how Thaddeus Stevens basically set the stage of Reconstruction and was essential for the success of proving the 14th and 15th Amendment, as far as also trying to protect the freedmen after the Civil War. So, without further ado, we'll be joining Fergus in his speech, which started a little bit after he began, but included most of the important parts. Thank you very much.
By the spring of 1861, a third of the seats in both chambers were empty. They'd been abandoned by members who defected to the Confederacy. Now, the Republicans, led by Stevens and some others, began an era of legislative activism that would change American society beyond recognition. And during the next 4 years, Congress would help win the war, craft the peace, reinvent the nation's financial system, and enact a raft of forward-looking legislation that had been blocked often for years and years by Southern stonewalling. Ultimately, Congress pointed the way toward the strong, activist national government that eventually came into being in the 20th century. And it also, for the first time in American history, enshrined protection of civil rights as the responsibility of the federal government. The two wartime Congresses were incredibly productive. They raised hundreds of thousands of troops for the Union. They instituted the first military draft. They pushed hard against Lincoln for more aggressive generals and more vigorous strategy against the South. In providing financing for the war, Congress created the country's first national currency, the forerunner of the IRS, and the foundation of the Federal Reserve System. And long before Lincoln became willing to contemplate the emancipation of slaves, members of Congress, led by Stevens, demanded it, enacting laws that turned abolitionism from a fringe belief into public policy, culminating, of course, in the 13th Amendment. Now, as Frederick Douglass said during the war, I like this quote: "The angel of liberty has one ear of the nation and the demon of slavery the other." Both of them whispered and shouted into the ears of Congress as it struggled forward. I'm going to skip over three other measures which are extremely important but not typically considered war measures: the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railway Act, the Land Grant Colleges Act. Those were all wartime measures that would not have been enacted were it not for the war. And Stevens had at least a finger in all of them. So I've built the story that I tell in this book primarily around four men. Three of them were Republicans. The fourth one who was Ohio Representative Clement C. Vallandigham, I'm guessing the most of you probably know that name, was the leading spokesman for the anti-war opposition. He's a Copperhead, of course. And he's, in a sense, the anti-Stevens in my book. And among the Republicans, I write a great deal about Senator Ben Wade of Ohio, who chaired the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which oversaw the Union war effort in the field, and William Pitt Fessenden of Maine, who chaired the extremely important Senate Finance Committee and worked very, very closely throughout the war with Stevens, who was, of course, the fourth man, not the least. But he's going to get the rest of this talk, so I wanted to let you know who else was in the book. Fourth was, of course, Thaddeus Stevens. No member of Congress was more central to every pivotal piece of wartime legislation. Not only was he the most fiery orator in the House and one of the most effective radicals in Congress, he was also a master of parliamentary strategy, as well as the House's de facto majority leader. That formal job didn't exist at the time. He was de facto floor manager. And I emphasize a master of parliamentary strategy. There were plenty of other radicals in Congress, notably, for example, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who were eloquent, passionate. Their hearts were profoundly in tune with Stevens, except they were lousy legislators. Stevens was a man who got things done. Remarkably so, since though many members found him personally abrasive, none ever challenged him as floor leader or faulted his determination to force through critical war measures. That's remarkable. That's a remarkable record. And I think it's not often appreciated even by many historians. So for a man in his 70s and in chronically bad health, Stevens was a prodigiously hard worker. And apart from the war measures that I've mentioned and we'll come back to, as chairman of Ways and Means, he also shaped every single money bill that emerged in the House, and he was shackled throughout the war to endless demands for appropriations. I read hundreds and hundreds of these letters of this type. $4,000 for stationery, $5,000 for furniture and packing crates, $25,000 to hire investigators to detect counterfeiters, increasing salaries for federal workers down to paying porters and waiters and the, as he wrote, honest, sober men who clean the Capitol's privies. Stevens was engaged in all of this. We know him as a man who's thinking great thoughts. He has a great vision for the nation. But this is the nitty gritty of his day, by the way. Don't worry, I'm not going to snow you with more detail like that. From the beginning, Stevens saw much more clearly than the majority of his colleagues how savage the war was going to be and what it would take to win it. Delusionally, many members of Congress, doubtless the majority, I think, thought it was going to be a short war, a comparatively painless war, and in fact, until Bull Run, they thought it would be a walkover in part of the Union. As you know, at least 750,000 people died. Stevens knew, however, that it would require a Herculean political effort, unimagined sacrifice of blood and treasure, and that it would upend deeply held prejudices of all kinds, not only on race, and it would sorely test the Constitution itself. As early as 1861, when conservatives, including Unionists, were still bent on preserving slavery because it was protected by the Constitution, Stevens bluntly challenged them. And this is kind of pure Stevens here. Stevens says, "Who says the Constitution must come in bar of our actions? It's an absurdity. When a country is at open war with an enemy, you have a right to use every means which will weaken them. The South would have to feel pain. If their whole country must be laid waste and made a desert in order to save this Union from destruction, so let it be." he really dismissed hand-wringing over constitutional concerns that he felt inhibited the war effort. You know that this was extremely controversial and hotly argued year after year. During one debate over war powers, and there were a great many, he declared, "You cannot justify 9 out of 10 acts here if you consider the Constitution a valid and binding instrument." He went on to say that the Constitution was a total nullity in the seceded states and that the war must be carried on upon principles wholly independent of it. And he cited, for example, the admission of West Virginia in 1863, for which there was no constitutional basis whatsoever, frequently pointed out at the time, for the way in which it was admitted. But Stevens supported it wholeheartedly because, like so much else, it would add another free state to the Union. And just after the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861, July 61, long before Lincoln and most of his fellow congressmen, Stevens called for both emancipation and arming the slaves. I'm quoting him. "I, for one, shall be ready to go for it. I, for one, shall be ready to go for it. Let it horrify anyone else." And he predicted that within about 2 years, former slaves would be marching south in federal uniforms. And he was just about precisely right. He argued from the beginning that the South's wartime economy depended on the sweat of slaves, which of course it did. By freeing white men for the Confederate Army, slavery gave the South a huge advantage. Whenever Union soldier was a man subtracted from the North's factories and farms. Stevens said, "Prejudice may be shocked, weak minds startled, weak nerves may tremble, but they must hear and adopt it. Those who now furnish the means of war, but are the natural enemies of slaveholders, must be made our allies. Universal emancipation must be proclaimed to all. Slave owners," he said, "can wail about a servile insurrection, as they constantly did. But what was more to be feared," he said, a rebellion of slaves fighting for their freedom, or a rebellion of free men fighting to murder the nation. You send forth your sons and brothers to shoot and saber and bayonet the insurgents, but you hesitate to break the bonds of their slaves to reach the same end." Robert Mallory, who was a Kentucky Unionist, very conservative Kentucky Unionist, and pro-slavery, indignantly declared of the Negro that, "Knowing his depraved nature as I do, putting a gun in the hands of a slave to shoot down white men was an unspeakable insult to the rules of civilized warfare. In addition," he claimed, "they were all cowards and not worth the expense of organizing them. One shot of a cannon would disperse 30,000 of them." Okay, now I'm giving you this because there's a lovely description by a journalist who was listening to this debate of Stevens's reaction to this. I'm quoting, "Stevens slowly unfolded himself from his desk, rising by degrees as a telescope is pulled out, his heavy toupee falling over his brow and his cold little eyes bristling with anger. He said, 'Why then object to them as a savage and barbarous race if one gun will disperse an army of them?' He sarcastically pointed out that so-called civilized nations, Portuguese, French, Dutch, English, and Americans during the Revolution, had all armed blacks. And he went on to say, 'I am for sending the army through the whole slave population of the South and asking them to come from their masters, to take the weapons which we furnish, and to join us in this war of freedom against traitors and rebels. I do not view it as an abolition or an emancipation question. I view it as the means and the only means of putting down this rebellion.'" Now, Stevens could have argued for emancipation and black recruitment solely as a pragmatic war measure, which he did. But instead, he went further, much further, and he was close to unique in this. He attacked white racism head on and challenged Congress and implicitly all Americans to transcend it. Racism, he implied, lay at the nation's very core. Even supposing that the army could be rebuilt with white volunteers alone, he asked, is that any argument against employing blacks? To those who claimed that Yankee soldiers would never fight alongside blacks, Stevens replied, if there were really soldiers who would throw down their weapons rather than fight with blacks, then in God's name, let them go. They are rebels in heart and ought to be in the Confederate Army rather than ours. He went on to condemn narrow and selfish patriotism, which embraces only one's own race and leaves the other numerous races of mankind to bondage and misery. This is quintessential Stevens, of course. It's magnificent oratory. It's some of the best that's ever been delivered on the floor of Congress. And by the way, I think you might, when you're listening to the evening news compared to the pallid, poll-tested, syntactically challenged, and soundbite-friendly language that passes for debate in Congress today. And I hope that there's a book waiting to be written just about Stevens's political speech, about his oratory, which is magnificent. It deserves full-length, detailed attention, much more than it's had so far. And I want to note, by the way, that alone in Congress, he even defended Chinese immigration. This is in '64. He defended Chinese immigration against the first attempt in history that a bill was offered to exclude them from the country. He'd probably never met a Chinese person. None lived in his district, none on the East Coast for that matter. With nothing to gain politically by speaking up, he showed that his empathy was all-encompassing in an age when racism was ubiquitous and widely justified, as you of course know, in both scripture and what counted for science in those days. Now, let's see, I had wanted to touch on something that Stevens is rarely given enough credit for, but it was absolutely essential to the war effort. And that was, as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, he essentially held the government's purse strings. And without his brilliant statesmanship and the powers of persuasion, the money to fight the war might never have been found. I read a great deal about this book. It's not as sexy as race, emancipation, and freedom, much less raising armies or pillorying generals and so on. But the war could not have been won without the creation of a prodigious pot of money. And Stevens did that together with William Pitt Fessenden of the Senate Finance Committee. And I had in mind to read you a very short section of the book, which really short, about a paragraph or two, that frames Stevens against Fessenden. But Ross, you asked me to talk about the Etheridge Conspiracy in '63.
Yes.
So what would you rather hear about? Pitt Fessenden and Stevens, or would you rather hear about the Etheridge Conspiracy?
I think everybody would probably like to hear both. Let's throw caution to the wind and maybe go over time.
Okay. Well, I'll give you both, and I will be as concise as I can be about it. So anyway, we're talking about finance here, and I will spare you the chapter and verse about financial policy, which I sometimes talk about to torture an audience, but I won't do that to you. So at any rate, these two men were together responsible for creating the financial machinery that was commensurate with the government's need. Their combined energies, it was said, truthfully, I think, were worth entire armies in the field. The two of them had much in common. They were skillful tacticians. Ross, why don't we go and look at Fessenden? You're going to see Stevens.
Okay.
While I'm talking, you can just get them. You'll see Stevens, then you'll see Fessenden. Here we go. You know who he is.
There's Wade.
Well, keep going. One more. There we go.
Let me go back. Okay.
And that was Clement Vallandigham. We'll forget about him. He was the traitor. So, At any rate, Fessenden and Stevens, their combined energies were worth entire armies in the field. The two had much in common. They were skillful tacticians, lawyers by training, single-mindedly committed to the Union, and bred from the same New England soil. Stevens, of course, was born in Danville, Vermont, and educated at Dartmouth. Both could be harsh and imperious. Colleagues sometimes refer to Stevens as chairman of the Committee of Mean Ways. Well, Fessenden was well known to have, I'm quoting, no patience for humbug and no tolerance for bores. I think the same could be said of Stevens. The self-contained Fessenden was reserved to the point of iciness, while Stevens, by contrast, although not exactly gregarious, was one of the most flamboyant men in the House. I'm quoting, a driver, bitter, quick as electricity, with a sarcastic, blasting wit, a younger member of Congress wrote. While Stevens was notorious as one of the House's leading abolitionists, the great mogul of abolitionism, a Lancaster, Pennsylvania newspaper called him, Fessenden counted himself as a pragmatist on the subject of slavery, yet he could be unexpectedly touched. In July, a visitor to Fessenden's home brought with him a small enslaved child who played on the carpet and chattered for an hour, impressing Fessenden with his intelligence. He wrote afterward to a friend, I'm quoting, the thought that it was owned like a dog by one of its fellow creatures made me utter fresh maledictions on an institution which upholds such an atrocity. And these were two tough guys. These were two of the toughest men in the Senate, and together in tandem, they were unstoppable. And I told you a little at the beginning about the kinds of financial policies that they pursued. So I will leave that, and we can come back to it if in the Q&A if anybody's really interested. And instead, I'll tell you about the Etheridge Conspiracy. I wish I had an image of the plotters. I don't. So how did this happen? The clerk of the House, Emerson Etheridge, a pro-slavery unionist from Tennessee, became deeply disillusioned with the Emancipation Proclamation. There were other like-minded border state unionists, and he negotiated with a guy with probably one of the best nicknames in Congress, Sunset Cox, and he was called Sunset because of a profoundly florid metaphor about a sunset he had deployed in a speech probably 15 years earlier, but it stuck with him for the rest of his life. Samuel Sunset Cox, very colorful, quite a good orator in his own right, although he was a conservative Democrat. He was deeply racist and came down on the wrong side of history. But nonetheless, he increasingly became a power in the House of Representatives, kind of a kingmaker within the Democratic caucus once Vallandigham went into decline. So Emerson Etheridge, clerk of the House, he's not a member, bear in mind, but under certain wartime legislation, the clerk really had immense power to approve or disapprove of the results of elections. And he and Cox worked out a plan whereby Etheridge would discount the elections of a whole swath. I'm forgetting the number. It might have been as many as 22 Republicans, and instead certify the election of that many conservatives and Democrats, mostly from the border states, but not only. Had the conspiracy succeeded, this is December of 1863, should have told you when it was, which is when the 38th Congress is being formed. Had that succeeded, they would have gained a majority. That coalition would have gained a majority, and it could have stopped the war effort in its tracks. that they did not succeed is due in large part to our hero, Thaddeus Stevens. Because Thaddeus Stevens, a man who knew everything that was going on in Congress, even if it was in the opposition's caucus, became aware of this scheme before it could be put into practice, but he held his fire and waited till the day when it would take place. He and a few of his own allies had decided, had worked out their own plan to pursue a very intricate parliamentary maneuver, which I can't take time to explain here. It's in my book, it's pretty clear, it's a lot of fun to read about, and basically exposed this maneuver in mid-career on the floor of Congress, and stopped it in its tracks. And Emerson Etheridge, who I don't know what he thought he was going to become, but he foresaw himself becoming a real power in Washington. You can almost see him under Stevens's acid tongue shrinking into a caterpillar and crawling away. It's quite a nice moment, and I mean, long forgotten, but it was not insignificant at the time. So that is the short version of Emerson Etheridge's would-be coup. So to wrap up here, I mean, I think, and I suspect that most people here would agree that Stevens deserves to be honored most of all as an apostle of racial equality, but also of constitutional pragmatism and a national government vigorous enough and flexible enough to lead the nation toward a future that very, very few other Americans had even glimpsed. He was perfectly well aware that he was an outlier even in his own party, but as he remarked in a speech to the House, they are coming along behind and will be up shortly. Well, it wasn't so shortly as it turned out, but and to us, to many Americans, that is, Congress may seem needlessly quarrelsome and inefficient, but I like to say that to remind people, because Americans have become so cynical about Congress and about, dare I say, much of national politics in general, that Congress's workings are really just the cacophony of our multitude of American voices distilled into 535 representatives and senators. And Republican politics, that's small r Republican politics, is always messy, and the founders knew it. They fought a revolution not to tame politics and make it simple and smooth, but to put it with all its frustrating turbulence into government. As Pitt Fessenden once said, he was highly quotable too, by the way, as he once said, "I would not have perfect quiet always. In a republic especially, you never find quiet except under a tyranny." Now, Thaddeus Stevens was a man who made a lot of noise. And by doing it, he helped make America the country that we live in today, and a far better place than it would have been if he'd never lived. And I will leave it at that. You can hurl questions or stones or whatever you care to at me. And
no stones. Let me stop this the sharing right now. Okay, now you're all back together. And people are clapping. So,
thank you.
There'd be probably a standing ovation if we could stand or something. I wanted to add 2 points, by the way, about what you were saying. And you're absolutely right. It is so neglected that Thaddeus Stevens was a financial genius. And he basically set the economy for winning the war. And as everybody knows, it's money, 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 money if you're going to run a war. And of course, the Confederates were complete novices, didn't know what the hell they were doing. And interestingly enough, I was reading a book by Alan Guzlo, very famous Civil War historian, and most of the book was about Lincoln, but he had one page in there where he basically said, Stevens basically changed the economy so they could win the war. And then after that one page, it was Lincoln, 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 and so on and so forth. And I also just want to point out about your comment about him being a political genius, which is, I think the Lincoln movie was one of this, I've said it's the greatest thing that happened to Thaddeus Stevens in the last 100 years because it was so positive towards him. However, some of the things are crazy, like the one scene where Lincoln is dictating political strategy to Stevens. That is just so incredible. Dictating to the greatest parliamentarian in U.S. history is just kind of bizarre. Now, since I'm in charge, I get to ask the first question. Okay, there seems to be two main schools of history. There's the great man school and the movement school. The first school is that great men change history. And the second is that mass movements, such as the Underground Railroad, are more important engines in history, and that the great men are relatively interchangeable. What do you think about efforts to diminish the importance of people like Thaddeus Stevens by the movement people?
Yeah, I like the question, Ross. Well, look, I wouldn't say that I was a member of either school, because I think history is extremely complex. It's complex. We rethink history every generation. And I think in the last, well, several generations, yeah, you're quite right, that the trend has certainly been to diminish the importance of individuals. And I mean, I think, well, of the Annales school of French history, which has taught us to, you know, read history, find history in the most minute kinds of records and the most tedious kinds of records. There's a lot of brilliant history that does that, but frankly, history is still about us. It's about human beings, and it's bizarre and absurd to suggest that people do not affect the politics of their time and help shape, let's call it trends, even as their movements, even as they too are somewhat shaped. And I think Stevens stands out. I mean, he's really a great example of how he is unique and he is remarkable. I mean, he's unique even among anti-slavery men, of course, as being wholly a political animal and having no patience whatsoever with pie-in-the-sky idealists with whom he agrees in principle, but he knows they're incompetent politically. And here's a man who you can't understand. You cannot understand the political history of the war without understanding Stevens's impact on it. Not only Stevens, there are others too. Ben Wade, I like Ben Wade as well, in a different sphere. And go back to our original great man, Washington. I mean, Washington, I wrote a book also called The First Congress, and I deal with Washington in that, even though it's also primarily a congressional book. Here's Washington, who was absolutely the best man for the moment. I mean, we were fortunate to have Lincoln at that moment. My heavens, would Salmon P. Chase have been able to wage the war with the kind of, would he have been able to understand the nation with the kind of gravity that Lincoln did? I suspect not. I think we'd have won it anyway. But I think I mean, any historian who fails, this is a gripe I often have with political scientists, by the way, who have become a very, very bloodless tribe in the last couple of generations. That if there aren't people, if you don't see people, if you don't, as both actors and the acted upon, you're not seeing what happened. I don't know if that's a fair answer, Ross.
Great, that's the answer I was looking for. Okay, now I'm going to open it up for questions. You're going to have to bear with me because I got two screens of people here. So raise your hand if you have a question.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Ross, Beverly.
Oh, Beverly. This is Beverly Palmer, who did the 2 volumes of Thaddeus Stevens' writings, which Fergus has dog-eared to death.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for your talk. I was very illuminating. And my question is about Lincoln. And I first heard about your book in a New Yorker review, which I'm sure you read. And when I saw that the book was out and Thaddeus Stevens was going to be prominent, I immediately got it out of our library. This is when the pre-pandemic days when the libraries were open. And the review made your book sound much more anti-Lincoln than the book was. And I was very pleased because I just don't think that you can belittle Lincoln's role in it. And I just wondered what you thought about that review of your book, if you thought that it was fair to your book. Again, somebody who lived with Stevens for many years, I applaud your treatment of him. I really don't have any quibbles at all about the way that you handled him in your book and all your citations, the documentation. But I'm just interested about the role of Lincoln versus Congress. I got the implication from the review that you were going to say Congress did it all, and I don't agree with that, and I don't think you do either. But do you think the review downplayed your book a little bit or your argument?
Yeah, Beverly, I congratulate you for your brilliant work on Stevens, by the way. I'm sorry we've never met. I had thought I should meet you when I was
I'd hoped to meet you too at this
We'll
meeting.
do it. We'll do it someday.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were on when we started, but I said, 20 years ago or so, Ross gave me the two volumes, and they are battered and dog-eared and scribbled upon in many different colors and so on. It's a wonderful piece of work. Well, your assessment is correct. There was nothing. I'll tell you how the book came to be written. There is a multitude of books about Abraham Lincoln. There is no end to them. My friend Harold Holzer has written a whole library of them. And every year, there are a couple of new and pretty good Lincoln books. Okay, we like talking about Lincoln, of course. Why wouldn't we? I had no interest in adding to the immense mountain of Lincoln books per se. I don't think I have anything original to say about Lincoln personally. But I have felt that it's the omission of Congress from the political story of the war has been strange and remarkable. And I think that tends to reflect the way, particularly over the last 70 or 80 years, the country has tended to see the executive as the central engine of government in the United States. In the 19th century, virtually all Americans considered it to be Congress, including Lincoln, by the way, although he was compelled to be a more decisive executive than he probably thought he would be. And what I wanted to do was show the war from Capitol Hill. In my book, the White House is a mile away, down there at the other, as it still is, of course, down at the other end of the avenue, and there's Lincoln sitting in his office, and Lincoln is not running Congress. There are so many interesting things that are happening in Congress, and if you're stuck in the Oval Office, so to speak, for 4 years of the war, you will never know. And I thought, frankly, that anybody reading this book would have read enough about Lincoln that he could fill in, or she could fill in as much as one needed. The review in the New Yorker, well, yeah, he didn't get the book, frankly, and I would say that's been true of several reviewers who really wanted me to write a book about Lincoln. And they're so imbued, I think, with the assumption that Lincoln essentially directed the entire war and that the only important decisions were made by Lincoln, that I was surprised by this, that I think I probably should have made my argument a bit clearer or a bit more strongly, and probably I should have given Lincoln a bit more ink, clearer that my respect for him is unbounded. So I was disappointed, frankly, that the reviewer, as good as Adam Gopnik and kind of failed to see the point, or the perspective, to appreciate the perspective. Good question. I liked answering.
Back on mute, Beverly.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing about that whole thing about Lincoln. My impression over the 20 years that I've been involved with the Thaddeus Stevens Society is that the Lincoln people sort of see the sun rise and set on Lincoln, and they're really touchy about anybody who will take anything away from his luster. And so that's probably one of the things that motivated them to attack you on that score. But
yeah, you're quite right, Ross. You said the same thing a lot more succinctly than I did. But anyway, yeah.
okay. Well, okay. Next person raise their hand. Let's see. I don't see anybody raising their hand on this page. Let me go to the next page.
Chris Prices.
Oh, okay, fine.
First of all, I think the book is marvelous, and it's on this topic we've just talked about. It's a wonderful corrective. I really like you to reflect on where we are right now in terms of the issues that you raise about both Congress and race. I mean, you suggest that Stevens is really at the very front of the line of whites who recognize the essential nature of racism, a word we're only coming to start to use with some clarity. And what is the line that you see from the era of the Civil War and his role in it with what we're struggling with race right now in the middle of this interregnum between the election and the inauguration?
Well, I have to say, sadly, that line is broken, or extremely thin through the many long, terrible decades of Jim Crow. You know, Stevens saw the future. He's one of those rare men who's really, Seward was another one, even though Seward is a different, whole other discussion. He really saw what the country, the potential on this kind of issue and what it would become. And they knew it would, to Stevens certainly, he knew it would take time. He knew it would take a long time. He was a realist, one of the things I like about him. He was absolutely realistic about what could be accomplished. And I'm currently writing a book about the federal war against the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s. And what you see in the 70s is, as you know, at the end of Reconstruction, a stake put in the heart of Stevens's vision. Stevens is gone by then, of course, but how was that thread preserved? It's preserved by that very small embattled number of Black members of Congress. And you had Black members right up to the turn of the century. Most people don't realize that. And then they pick up again. Then there's a gap of about 20, 30 years and so on. But the heirs to Stevens's vision are among the founders of the NAACP at the turn of the 20th century. And there's far more, let's say, organizing in the field of opposition to Jim Crow, to lynching. And there's a living memory of Reconstruction and Stevens's vision of the three great amendments. Amongst Black Americans, white Americans put their heads in the ground, by and large. Not totally, but by and large just stuck their heads in the ground and said, we don't need to think about this. But it lives among Black Americans. And Stevens, as I said, you can't separate his vision from his pragmatism. He would propose a radical bill. He proposes emancipation in 1861. He knew it wasn't going to pass. He knew it wasn't going to pass, but he put his flag in the ground. And I admire people in politics who actually know how to get things done, rather than grandstanding. And if people can combine both great expressiveness, not grandstanding, expressiveness like Stevens. Hubert Humphrey was like that before he shot himself, he kneecapped himself with the Vietnam War. If you go back, read, and you can get this online in 2 minutes of Googling. Hubert Humphrey's great speech on civil rights, the 1948 Democratic Convention.
That's right.
One of the great speeches in American political history, should be known by everybody. And so there's Humphrey in 1948 picking up Stevens's flag and carrying it forward. And when I look at today's political landscape, I really kind of in my own mind separate the practical idealists, the pragmatic idealists, from people who purely prefer to make noise and don't understand how to make things happen. So but Congress is the arena for that. I've written now 3 books about Congress, and it gets more interesting all the time. So is that Eleanor Roosevelt in the back of your office?
You and I met in Hyde Park. I was head of the Franklin and Roosevelt Institute.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So, and by the way, does Du Bois give Thaddeus Stevens in his due in his book on Black Reconstruction?
I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I've used that book a lot. I haven't read it for Stevens.
I don't think he does, which is, he wrote a book on John Brown where he fully appreciates that, but I don't think he did. Because of course that's 1935. As you say, there are many epochs between on the race issue.
And we know that Stevens had basically been airbrushed out of history by the 1930s. And 20, 30 years ago, and I mean, those of you who are in Pennsylvania know all about this, how the Stevens house was almost torn down in Lancaster because the city determined in all its wisdom to erase it and put this gigantic convention center on the spot. A grassroots movement came up and they saved a chunk of the house. Frankly, it's a scandal they tore down as much as they did, but at least there's something there. And I wrote an article, a magazine piece for Smithsonian in the 90s about Buchanan and Stevens, because they're both Lancastrians at that point.
What a contrast.
Had no interest in Stevens. It was all Buchanan all the time in Lancaster, So he had really, and I think even a lot of what you would call liberal-minded people had really absorbed, without quite knowing it, the Dunning interpretation, or the
Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, Birth of a Nation, and that's what was in there somewhere back in their heads, that he was kind of a warped old character, and that was about it.
By the way, the portrait is of Francis Perkins, not of Roosevelt.
Okay. Well, let's move on to someone else. I'm going to put you back on mute, Christopher. So thank you very much for the question. Okay. Anybody else? Raise your hand. Okay, Don, let me unmute you. I'm trying to unmute you. Okay, you're unmuted. No, hold it. Let me try something here. Okay. Wait here.
Here
Okay. There
I think I muted myself.
There you are, Don. By the way, just before Don asks a question, Don has the distinction of writing the only full-length play about Thaddeus Stevens.
Thanks, Russ. I'm writing an article, a rhetorical analysis of Thaddeus Stevens' education speeches. And I'm just interested, this question might be addressed more to Beverly than you, but anyone who knows any articles or references to rhetorical analyses of Thaddeus Stevens. I've read lots of things about his oratory, his history of his speeches, the political, social involvements, but not a rhetorical analysis of anything. Has anyone read anything or can refer me to things?
Don, is it Don or Donald? Anyway,
Don.
Beverly speaking.
I met you a long time ago, Beverly.
Yeah, right.
And I really appreciate the work you've done.
Well, thank you. I gave a talk once at the Thaddeus Stevens School about Stevens' rhetoric.
Right. Well, I taught there. I'm a professor emeritus.
Oh, well, then maybe,
college.
anyway, I could send you a copy of that. I was trying to work it into an article and it just never materialized.
I was there.
So maybe you already have it, but I'd be happy to send it to you if you would like to look at it. So I'm just bpalmer@pomona.edu, and send me a message and I'll send it off to you.
I appreciate that.
I didn't pursue it, but I have a lot of examples of his rhetoric because I wasn't trying to turn him into Abraham Lincoln, but I was trying to talk about, I compared him with Charles Sumner's speeches and the 2.5 hour, full of all the classical examples and so forth. So I'll send it to you. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
I'll also follow up and I'll send on your email address, Beverly. So
okay.
Thank you very much.
Each other. So I'm going to put you back on mute and we'll move on to someone else. The mute button seems to work well. Okay. Okay, who else has a question? George. Okay. I'm having problems with this unmuting. Say something, George. Nope, I haven't unmuted. Oh, there you go.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Well, this is just, I hope it's not a frivolous question, but in the line of detective work. So the screenshot that you had, the sketch early on in your presentation that was subtitled, the subtitle began "Dramatic Debates in Congress" and so on. It looks, I would tend to agree that the physical stance that you mentioned, we would like to think is Stevens, but it looks to me on the enlargement I have on my big screen that Stevens might be the figure in the center of the sketch, falling backwards with what looks to me like a club foot in the air and a wig being dislodged. It looks like he's falling backward. But my real question is, might you have, as a close student of Congress, a diagram of the floor of the House at that time to perhaps identify who the people are in and out of their various desks?
Okay, I just like to see that as Stevens. Okay.
Well, I agree with you. It's a very dramatic, it's a dramatic stance, but so is the guy in the middle of the thing falling backward. It's not as large a photo, but I mean, does a diagram exist of the
Yes.
layout of the desks
Yes.
of the House at that time?
Okay, two things. One, this picture, I believe, may in fact slightly predate the war. Okay, I'm not positive. It was recast once or twice, and in fact, you'll also see a young boy, a page, obviously, right in the front, wearing a red jacket and blue trousers. That page is obviously black. I don't know for a fact. I think in an earlier rendering, that page was white. Okay, a black page post-war, white page pre-war. Anyway, so I will not stake my reputation on the provenance of this particular image. That said, are there diagrams? Yes, you should find one readily in at the beginning of the Congressional Globe for any given session. And they exist. I've printed them out from time to time. But the problem is I can't tell you really what session this was in the picture. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting problem.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to put you back on mute, George. Okay, anyone else have any questions? Let me see, I gotta check my other one here. Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, okay, Jeremy.
Hi.
Or, yeah,
Hi.
okay, go ahead.
I'm Esme. My husband's Jeremiah, and our 15-month-old son is named Thaddeus after Thaddeus Stevens.
Great.
And we're enjoying this. He's not showing up, but
Everybody else present.
sorry,
Oh,
everybody is
okay.
present.
There he is.
There he is. So thank you very much. This has been really interesting. I guess I had two questions. One was a follow-up to a different question, or I guess they sort of both are. You mentioned that Thaddeus Stevens had gone sort of completely out of fashion for a while, and I was wondering what brought him back to the extent that he has been brought back. And the other was, I don't mean to out your political views, but I was curious as a student of Congress, sort of who today you see as sort of bridging the mantle a bit of both, you know, being sort of practical and idealistic. If you don't mind saying that, if you,
Sure.
but don't worry if you do.
I'll talk politics all day long, but I'll spare you. Sorry, give me your first question again.
Sorry, it was about what you feel like the resurgence of interest in Thaddeus Stevens after he'd been
That is really easy to answer because the source is sitting right here on this call. His name is Ross Hedrick,
Too much credit.
who has turbocharged the rediscovery of Stevens, and thanks to the friends of Thaddeus Stevens and with that, well, without Ross and his allies here, I fear that Thaddeus Stevens would still be just a ghost in our memories. But that said, in a larger sense, only after Black history was kind of discovered and treated seriously, beginning in the 1960s, did scholars, and then little by little, some other Americans begin to pay attention again to abolitionists. And Stevens is not an anomaly, but he is remarkable in that he was a purely political man who was also an abolitionist. He was not a movement abolitionist. In fact, he was very impatient with a lot of movement abolitionists because they were, I think he would have said something like fuzzy-headed. They didn't know how to get things done. And he was very dismissive of John Brown, by the way, who I find quite an interesting character. Stevens just blew him off until he's crazy. That's not me, that's Stevens, okay? And it's been a long haul to refine Stevens. And I don't think we're entirely there yet either, by the way. There is a new biography coming out in March,
Right.
which I'm reviewing for the Wall Street Journal. So it's going to at least get some attention. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. It's comparable, I would say, to the Hans Triffus biography of a couple of decades ago. But it's going to get reviewed. It's going to have attention paid to it. In fact, I have it right over here. I'll pick it up in a few minutes and show it so you can see it. So I think Stevens is being rediscovered. It's still a process. We're not entirely there yet, but I do think we have been bit by bit dismantling this grotesque idea about Stevens that was enshrined in Birth of a Nation, this brilliant, horrible movie that has shaped so many Americans' impressions. Okay, second question. Come back to me now. It's longer answering that than I thought.
I think the question was, who would be comparable to Thaddeus nowadays?
Okay, well, okay, where I come from, I'll be very simple. I'm a traditional liberal Democrat, lifelong Democrat. I come from, and I've been an active Democrat. I was a party chair in a place where I lived some years ago, and so on. And I find that that's the part of the Democratic Party where you find pragmatic idealists. And I'm not sure that I'd single out one person or another, but I find, without getting into today's politics, because I bet there's a lot of disagreement even within this, the people who are on this call, but I think the further left wing of the Democratic Party basically lost the election for the pragmatic liberals in the House and the Senate last month. So that's my perspective. And I am, who would I have preferred? Personally, I would have preferred Elizabeth Warren. My heart's with kind of where Elizabeth Warren is. I'm perfectly happy with Joe Biden because I think this is a man who, like Stevens, though he's not a Stevens by any stretch, is the kind of man who knows how to make the machinery work. And if you can't make the machinery work, it doesn't matter how woke you are. That's my take. I'm sure there's people feel differently on this call, but that's where I come from.
I'll get you to you, Steve, in just a second. I just wanted to follow up on what Fergus said. Thank you very much for your kind words about my efforts for Thaddeus Stevens, but I don't think I've done enough. But I would have to say that if I was going to point to somebody, it would be Eric Fauner, who has been tremendous as far as resurrecting Reconstruction, particularly as one of the great eras of our history, rather than, you know, a tragic era as it had been called in the past. The one thing about revising Thaddeus Stevens' reputation and giving him the due that he is due is the trend that we have now of dismissing all of the contributions from white males, which I hope that, you know, we can, you know, go forward and give everybody, black and white, all the due they have for, you know, fighting for humanity. So anyway, with that, I'll try to unmute Steve for his question. Say something, Steve. Hold it. Okay, let's see. I think you can unmute as you're, okay, here you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
I didn't have a question. Actually, when the gentleman was mentioned the woke culture, I was pretending to be a member of the woke culture. So it's sheer histrionics. But let me just briefly say, very quickly, I am a longtime friend of Harold Holzer, by the way. I used to work with him. That I am now here on Long Island in my own little puddle, going on with an ongoing debate dialogue with the local BLM crowd. And the massive schism between idealism and practical getting it done, it's incredible. I mean, I love the left, and I am of the left, but these people are so sealed off in a mind system as to, and the speaker raised this point just now in the Q&A. It's remarkable. And I'm going to go back to this crowd and say, look, you guys, you've got to be able to get something done, not just have the vision. If you're going to sequester yourself solely within the vision, there's no do. Nothing's going to happen short of revolution and just a complete reinvention of the country, which is not going to happen. So I know Ross. I just stumbled into this event. I was excited to be able to attend, but I was happy to hear the speaker, and it reminded me of this current little debate. I'm the liberal. I'm the mellow guy. The woke people, the close the prisons, defund the prisons. They take it really, and God bless them. They take it seriously. They force me to think about it. A world without police, a world without prisons, it sounds preposterous. But they're so aggressive, it makes me think. But in terms of getting something done, not so much.
Okay. I'm going to put you back on mute, Steve, and maybe you want to comment on that, Fergus.
I wholly agree. I wholly agree. That reflects pretty much my own views. I live here in San Francisco, by the way, which is the epicenter of wokeitude, you know. I mean, believe me, it's the norm. It's not a debate here. It's the norm, and it's the only place I've ever lived. I'm a New Yorker, by the way, in reality, but it's the only place I've ever lived where I've been called a conservative. You know, I think this only staunch, tough, pragmatic liberals can win that, can put an end to the irrationality and unreasonableness and unmoored idealism, let's call it, the unmoored idealism of today's left. In the same way that, frankly, only mainstream Republicans, whatever they are, frankly, but let's say sane Republicans can deal with the Tea Party. Liberals cannot persuade the Tea Party to do anything, nor can screaming right-wing Republicans persuade our woke friends.
Now, you had some great questions. What I would ask is wait until right now. I'd like to switch gears and Q&A, and you can ask questions both of Fergus and also of me or George about the play. So George wants to talk. Try talking, George. Yep, haven't quite gotten it. Let me.
There we go.
Now I figured it out.
Dr. Bordewich, thank you very much for your presentation. Most impressive. I think the sound quality on the video could have been better, but then I had the advantage of knowing the script in advance. Two questions. As far as the so-called revival of interest in Thaddeus Stevens, where would you put Steven Spielberg and Tommy Lee Jones? That's the first part in there. If you saw the 2012 biopic called Lincoln. And the second question is apropos of contemporary politics, particularly since they share the state of Vermont, or is it the Commonwealth? Is it one of our few Commonwealths of Vermont in common? What do you think Thaddeus Stevens would make today politically of Bernie Sanders?
Okay, well, I thought the film was great. I thought it was great as a work of a work of art addressing history. Okay, it's not history per se, but it's pretty good in treating history. I mean, we can pick holes here and there. I have a couple of favorite holes that I like to pick, but never mind, it's not important here. I mean, one of them happens to be Thaddeus Stevens in bed with Lydia. But okay. I mean, there's enough smoke there. I think that's something that Americans who are into Americans today, you know, want to know about the inner, the psychological, the emotional, and the sexual lives of people, all of which used to be off limits once upon a time. And it's pretty predictable that a filmmaker would want to do something with that. I don't think it's sustained by the evidence, but I don't think it's, let's say, beyond possibility, although I don't think it actually represented their relationship particularly accurately. I mean, even in the way they conversed with each other, but okay. I don't think she was Mrs. Stevens, no matter what else she might have been. And well, Ross put his finger earlier on the scene in which Lincoln gives strategic advice to Stevens, which is, which is a screamer, frankly, if you know Stevens, or if you know how legislation actually works. But look, I think artists can do anything. I'm not somebody. I don't believe in putting a gun to the head of a creative artist who's trying any more than I would shoot Lin-Manuel Miranda for doing Hamilton. Ron Chernow loved it. Of course, it has sold a bajillion books for Ron Chernow, but but nonetheless, I think there was a guy, Miranda, engaging in an imaginative way with history, and I thought it was very interesting for that. And Spielberg engaging with Lincoln, not bad. And I thought Daniel Day-Lewis's performance was just
Well, did you think that it contributed to a bump up, that the film contributed to a bump up in interest in Stevens?
Maybe I can't demonstrate that one way or the other. I don't know. I don't know.
I'm gonna add my experience, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
Because as the editor, when the movie came out, I got a lot of emails. Well, what did you think about Tommy Lee Jones and so forth? And so there was interest. And then I found, like, when I would go in to get my morning coffee, and I have a Thaddeus Stevens mug, and I would take that in, and people would say, "Oh, Thaddeus Stevens." And so I think it really did, I didn't have to explain who he was. And that was a real plus, I guess I would say, not just for me, but to bring him out into the popular mind. And of course, I hoped that Jones was going to get the supporting actor award, and was very disappointed when he didn't, because I think he did a wonderful job of portraying him. And I agree absolutely with you, Fergus, about the bedroom scene.
I think,
and reciting the 13th Amendment and so forth. That was just pure Hollywood.
I'll get to you, Nadia, in just a second, but I can confirm that it definitely increased the interest. We actually were, for years, sliding along at 40 members. And when the movie came out, we got an avalanche of interest from our webpage. I was sending out a book a week for months. And also our membership doubled. And it has actually increased up to 160, including people in foreign countries. We have about half a dozen people from foreign countries. And and that has stayed at that level, since then. So that movie, as I have said in articles, is the best thing that ever happened to Thaddeus Stevens in the last 100 years. So, talking about the interest, I have some contributions, but, probably if you look at it, the Lincoln movie, was perhaps the biggest factor in bringing back Thaddeus Stevens.
That's very interesting, Ross. Thanks for sharing that. And I'd just like to add parenthetically that the only thing that actually really annoyed me in a modest way about Tommy Lee Jones's performance, great actor, great embodiment of Stevens, but that he had a Texas accent. However Stevens spoke, he didn't sound like a Texan.
He probably would have gotten the Oscar because he lost out to Django Unchained, that maniac dentist, with the Quentin Tarantino movie, which are horrible. I think basically Tommy Lee Jones kind of shot himself in the foot because in reality he's kind of an friendly person in Hollywood, and as probably most people may or may not know, the Academy Awards are political as well as artistic in their nature. So in my book, he should have gotten that Oscar. So anyway, let me turn on Nadia and see what she has to say. Let's see, unmute. Okay. Say something, Nadia. I'm still having trouble with this unmuting. Let me just try here something. Unmute. Okay, hold on. Try unmuting on your side, Nadia. Okay, here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Fine. I want to say the movie Lincoln made a huge impact. I did not know anything about Thaddeus until Lincoln. And that film put me in contact with Google to look for more information about him. And in the process, I discovered you. And I'm so grateful that I have found you, because I learned so much more about Thaddeus. And a lot of people that I do know that saw that movie, African Americans, have a great admiration for Thaddeus Stevens today. And I want to just make that comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to also comment that Nadia actually organized a whole group of people to come down so I could, take them around in Lancaster and show them all the Thaddeus Stevens sites and such like that, including, I believe, your state representative from that area. So it was, I tell you, it's one of my greatest joys in this thing is just talking about Thaddeus Stevens. So that was just a wonderful day.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to put you back on mute, and I'm going to see if there's some other people who want to talk.
Okay, sure.
So George, just see if somebody else wants to talk before you talk again. Hold on. Anybody else wants to talk? Let me check the other. Nobody else wants to talk right now? Oh, before I recognize George, I see from the chat part that people had trouble hearing the dialogue in the video. So let me just give you a real quick recap of what happened. What happened was Thaddeus Stevens and Edward McPherson came up with a plan, and Edward McPherson was the clerk of the House. And like every other session of the clerk of the House, he starts to call off the roll, and he gets to the Southern names, and he skips them. Okay, he doesn't call them out. The Southerners jump up and down and say, you can't do that, you can't do that. Thaddeus Stevens got up and said, point of order, we can discuss no business until we call the roll. The roll was finished, the Southerners were out, and that was the beginning of Reconstruction. So now we'll go back to George, and let me see if I can unmute you.
Okay.
Okay,
Am I on? Yeah. So I'm Dr. Bordewich. I'm still waiting to hear about Bernie Sanders, Stevens' fellow, quote, Vermonter. And while we're at it, I think, Ross, isn't the audio of that playlet that you're just talking about much clearer on the Thaddeus Stevens Society website than it was?
It's not on the website, it's on our YouTube channel. If people want to go back, we have all sorts of, you go on YouTube and you type in Thaddeus Stevens, one of those things will be our YouTube page, and you can go there, and there are all sorts of Thaddeus Stevens videos. So, Fergus, you want to talk about?
Okay. Well, I think I can dispatch this fairly quickly since, regrettably, I don't have Thaddeus here at my elbow to ask, but I think he would. I think he'd find Bernie Sanders kind of annoying. Somebody who likes to suck the air out of the room when he's speaking, and somebody who presumes to know everything that needs to be known. By the way, I've met Bernie Sanders. A few times. I like him a lot. I mean, he's a New Yorker. He reminded me of a lot of people I went to college with, actually. So I'm nothing. I don't mean to put Bernie Sanders down. I'm trying to imagine myself into Stevens's shoes here, or his boot, I guess. And I think he would have found Sanders very much kind of the way he found Sumner, although Sumner was a rather posh sort of personality, unlike Sanders, who's a proletarian type, at least in his manners. Because Sanders is notoriously a loner in the Senate, notoriously so, notoriously or famously ineffective as a senator, regardless of what his campaign might have suggested. I've spent a lot of time in Washington and have written quite a bit about the Senate. And, he's been a party of one many times. I mean, I was somewhat surprised, actually. He came out and actually threw himself behind somebody else in the presidential contest here. So I think that's perhaps, although he would have recognized Sanders as a like-minded ally, as Stevens certainly recognized Sumner, they corresponded. Their letters are pretty good. They knew where each of them stood, and they knew they were both in the same trench, facing the same enemy. And I think Stevens certainly would have seen Sanders that way. By the way, since I've got the floor for a second, I want to hold up this new Stevens book titled, surprisingly, Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary. It's by, I think you can see there, Bruce Levine.
Well, you've got an actual copy. We will have Bruce Levine for our next Zoom meeting, which will be on April the 2nd. So people will actually be able to talk to him, and we'll also be sending out an email for people to buy advance or buy copies before the book's coming out at the beginning of
March.
Beginning of March, and our annual graveside ceremony, which won't be by the graveside this year, will be April the 2nd, which is close to Thaddeus Stevens' birthday of April the 4th. I do want to say one good thing about good old Bernie is that he got the Danville post office named after Thaddeus Stevens. So that's one of his few accomplishments. So unless there's somebody with some other pressing question, we'll move on to the business portion of the meeting. Is there anybody else that has? Okay, one more. Diane, hold on. Let me see if I can get you unmuted here.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Hold on. Okay.
I got it. Okay. I just wanted to say I'm here today because of a different book. I'm in the process of reading your book, Bound for Canaan. And I'm just thrilled. It's really delighted, great. It reads so well. And, I've, in the last couple of years, gotten involved with Ross and George in the Abolitionist Day, event that we have. And so I just really appreciate that book.
Thanks, Diane. Nice to hear it.
Okay. Okay, we'll move on to our next portion of our meeting, which is the, I seem to maybe have lost some people, maybe not. No, I haven't lost people, just more people leaving. We're down to 24 participants. So now we're going to actually have an actual business meeting for the Thaddeus Stevens Society. And just to make this a little easier, unless somebody wants to comment about something, what we usually do is I give an explanation. We have somebody who will move, somebody will second, and unless somebody needs to say something, what I would like you to do is if you're going to move or second something, to raise your hands, and I will repeat your name and perhaps even spell it for our secretary who is taking notes. I see Valerie is a square, but we will proceed that way and see how that works. So the first thing on our agenda is the minutes, which was a link in the invitation that I sent to. So I was wondering if anybody first has any questions or changes to the minutes before we vote on them.
Excuse me, Ross, I need to sign off here. I've got a very important phone call coming in. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for making this possible, and to everyone who participated.
And you can see everybody clapping. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
I guess it's still kind of early out in San Francisco. So
yeah, mid-afternoon.
Okay. Have a great day. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks.
So, getting back to the agenda, is there any questions about the minutes? Okay. So if we have no questions about the minutes, can someone raise their hand to move that we approve the minutes? Anybody want to raise their hands? Okay, Nabia moved, and that's Nabia Little, Little, N-A, it's our first name is N-A-B-I-A. So, and then the second is going to be Don Rhodes, R-H-O-A-D-S. And so all in favor, raise your hands to approve the minutes. Okay, great. It's approved. The next thing is the financial report. Does anybody, okay, I hope that you had some chance to look at it, maybe not. We're actually, I just wanted to tell you about our finances are doing very well. A lot of it's because we've gotten some lifetime members recently, like Carolyn Quadrella, who's still there. She's a lifetime member, and we also have a Jim Avery and a Angela Powell. All those people help us out quite a bit with our money, and so despite the pandemic, we are doing pretty well. But we do have a lot of things coming up, so we always can use, more money. So does anybody have any? Let me see if I can point out a few. We did, in the course of the year, get over $3,000 for our efforts to raise money for the Thaddeus Stevens house. I would like to see us get up to at least 10,000 so that we make a good contribution for that. As you can see, the lifetime memberships, we've gone up. We got $2,466 for that. And we also are cleaning up, or we're getting in the last of the statute pledges. So far this year, we got $5,000. We still have some of those pledges coming in, which we won't need until the end of this year. So any particular questions on that, on the financial report? Okay. All in favor of approving the financial reports, raise your hand. Or actually, first off, do I have a move? Nabia Little will move that, and Don will second it. That makes it easy. All in favor, say aye. Okay. The next thing on the agenda is officer nominations. These are nominations for the next 2 years, and we'll vote on the nominations next year. And the nominees for this year are myself as president, George Machamp as treasurer, and Valerie Fisher as secretary. And so do I have a motion? Or let me ask you this, are there any other nominations for officers for the next 2 years? Okay, great. I guess that's a vote of confidence. Do I have a motion to close the nominations? Don moves the nominations, and you want Nabia to second it? Okay. All in favor, say aye. Okay, that passes. The next thing is a little bit more controversial. For several years, we have been giving a $500 donation to Thaddeus Stevens Cemetery. In fact, we're the largest contributors to the Thaddeus Stevens Cemetery. And I would like to, if financially possible, to increase that donation to $1,000 a year. So is there anybody who wants to talk about that? Oh, let me first off ask, is there a motion to increase the donation to $1,000 a year? Okay, we'll go with Don Gallagher this time as the mover, and that Gallagher is Gallagher, and then Don Rhodes as the second. And so everybody in favor? Well, is there any discussion about that? Anybody have any questions or comments about increasing the donation? Okay, so all in favor, raise your hands. We keep on getting fewer people. I guess this isn't scintillating Zoom, so the motion passes. The next thing is an approval for something I hope that we can do to maybe increase the visibility of the Thaddeus Stevens Society, which is the creation of a 5-person advisory committee. I noticed that a lot of organizations have advisory committees listed on the side of their letterhead and such. And so I thought maybe we ought to try to get people like Eric Fauner and perhaps Fergus and other outstanding historians to be an advisory committee that would perhaps meet ever so often to give us suggestions on what we should be doing and such like that. So is there a motion that we have a 5-person advisory committee? We wouldn't be paid, but it would be honorary. So Don Rhodes, R-H-O-A-D-S, moves, and Margarita Wilson seconds. That's a new second for us. Any discussion about that? Nope, nobody discussing. Okay. So all in favor, raise your hands.
Ross.
Yeah, you got George.
Ross.
Oh, no, Don.
Ross, I would ask Beverly if she's interested in serving on that too. I think she'd be a great asset.
I think Beverly has left.
Oh, okay.
She's still back there. You want to be on it, Beverly? Let me see if I can unmute her. Just a second.
Yeah. No, I'd be happy to keep my involvement in the Thaddeus Stevens Society. Yeah.
And you'd be willing to be on the advisory committee and have your name listed on the side of our.
Sure. That's fine. Yeah.
And you had a question. Oh, okay. I'm going to mute you again. I'm going to see if I can get Navia to unmute here. Okay, say something, Navia. Oh, I haven't quite unmuted. I'm not sure what's happening here.
I think we have to unmute ourselves.
No, we'll see. Okay. There we go.
Hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. How many members for the advisory committee?
5.
5. Okay. Can we make recommendations?
Sure.
Can we make recommendations?
Do you want to make a recommendation now, or do you want to?
No, I want to check with a history professor I know.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I look forward to it.
Okay.
Okay, so the next, I think okay, all in favor of that, of the advisory committee? Okay. The next thing is not a motion, but basically, and of course, I probably should have done this when we had a bigger audience, is we have 2 big events coming up actually 3 big events if you include 2022. I mentioned that on our next Zoom meeting, which will be in April, we will be having Bruce Levin, the author of the new biography on Thaddeus Stevens. So I would urge everybody to come to that. Hopefully by July, this pandemic will be under control. And we have plans for a second founding day in Gettysburg in the first block of Stevens Street, where we will be having a festival, a history festival with a lot of historical organizations involved, and perhaps also food vendors, because everybody eats, to basically celebrate the second founding of the United States with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And hopefully we'll be able to make that a big event, maybe even get national publicity about that. And then the really, really big event will be in April of 2022, when we will unveil the statue of Thaddeus Stevens somewhere in the Gettysburg area. We haven't found a place yet. Plus, I hope, since this is going to be the 230th birthday of Thaddeus Stevens, that we can have seminars and banquets, both in Lancaster and Gettysburg, and maybe fireworks and a billboard saying, "Happy birthday, Thad," or something like that. So I want to start planning on that. So if there's people who want to help out on that, you can send me an email and I'll put you on the list. So that moves us to the next to last thing, other business. Is there anybody that wants to bring up other business at this time? Nope. Okay. Well, then, do I have a motion to adjourn and a second? Okay, so Don Rhodes is moving to adjourn, and George Machamp is seconding that. All in favor of adjourning, raise your hands. All right, thank you very much. I think this was a wonderful Zoom meeting that everybody enjoyed. I certainly enjoyed it. And so thank you very much. And I'll end this. I think it was pretty successful overall. I didn't lose anybody, and nobody did anything rude on the Zoom call.
Thanks, Russ.
Okay, bye.
You. Thank you.
Thank you.